without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rachel Armstrong.
We built this city. We built this city on rock and roll. Built this city. We built this city on rock and roll.
Good morning, everyone. The city of Venice stands proudly on the shores of a lagoon in northern Italy by the Adriatic Sea. She's a beautiful city, a pioneering city, a city of adventure, a place of splendor, an intimate encounter with romance. She has transformed the whole of Europe through trade, inspired the Constitution of the United States of America, and represents the very best within all of us. To be unmoved by Venice is to have a heart of stone. And yet, this fair damsel of a city is floundering like Ophelia in the relentless iceberg-fueled Adriatic tides with its periodic aqua alta, which slobbers on her fabric, chemically digesting her and battering her body with its elemental army of invaders, the wind, the waves, the weather, again and again and again. And Venice, a city that should never have existed in the first place, has so far defied the ravages of nature by allying herself with the latest technologies of her time. Between the 9th and the 12th century, when the city-state was being founded, these technologies were agricultural ones that involved the drainage of water, the digging of canals, and the use of wood piles to shore up the foundations of the building. And in modern times, although she's had a rather difficult relationship with industrial mechanical technologies that have drunk her aquifers dry and polluted her shores, they have nevertheless come to her rescue. In 2003, the construction of the Moses Gates began, which are a series of 78 hydraulically powered mechanical barriers that by 2014 will chew back on the Adriatic's advances like a giant sea beast. Yet environmentalists fear that this robotic titan of Canute will precipitate irreversible damage to the lagoon's ecology. But what if we stopped trying to save our magnificent damsel and designed a technology, those artificial interventions that she so adores, to help her save herself and fight back against the elements in a struggle for survival? That's completely implausible, right? Beyond my poetic personifications, how could a city conceivably rise up and defend herself against such an assault? Especially since the Enlightenment, we have imagined the material world as being made of brute and dumb stuff that submits to our command. Over the course of the 20th century, quantum physics taught us that matter is strange and full of creative contradictions. The subatomic world from which materials spring is an existential paradox, and its inherent contradictions may prove to be the agencies that enable matter to act beyond the prevailing Enlightenment mathematical descriptions of nature, which we call natural law, and without breaking any of the laws of physics, and without recourse to any vitalizing forces or human instruction. David Deutsch reminds us that computation can only be carried out in the material world. Everything else we think of as being information and computing and physics, including big data, is only a representation. Back in 1959, Richard Feynman noted that there was plenty of room at the bottom for creativity at the atomic scale and proposed a new science of nanotechnology, which invoked the assembly of molecular machines as a way of programming the power of the material world. Today, nanotechnology has conferred materials with some intriguing new optical, electrical, and magnetic behaviors, such as light-emitting materials used in electronic visual displays. However, these nanoparticles tend to be embedded within traditional materials, which means that their overall behavior is a quirky version of what we already know, rather than being a revolutionary encounter with matter. Andrew Ellington observes that there are significant hardware and software issues for nanotechnology, since it is not only a very difficult thing to do to build at such a tiny scale, but the molecular machines are even more challenging to connect together. Tom Knight observed that biology is a nanotechnological computer, and many of the properties that we'd associate with living things, such as growth and movement and sensitivity, are forms of material computing. The new science of synthetic biology, which involves the design and engineering of living things, is founded on this basis. It most commonly takes the form of modifying genetic programs of living things, which reside in a giant molecule called DNA. But it may also involve self-assembling organic building blocks called biobricks. But biology and its building blocks are not the only kinds of molecular programming languages. There are even deeper engineering principles that underpin the behavior of living things. These chemical languages were being explored in the 19th century when researchers like Moritz Traub, who was a wine merchant, grew what he proposed was the first artificial plant cell from a crystal in dilute solution. And Stéphane Leduc, who coined the term synthetic biology, was also growing lifelike osmotic structures from chemical solutions. Indeed, when Alan Turing was designing his computing machine, he observed that his algorithms were just approximations of the natural world, and he was also thinking about a way of programming that was much more like nature. So this idea of natural computing has led to a whole new field of computing practice, which applies unconventional techniques and materials to extend the realm of programmable matter into terrains beyond biology. A number of cutting-edge science groups have risen to this challenge. Andy Adamatsky's unconventional computing group at the University of West England experiment with chemical patterning systems, such as Liesegang rings, shown here, to explore the behavior of matter. Klaus-Peter Zauner's group at the University of Southampton is working with slime mold and chemical nervous systems. Lee Cronin's group at the University of Glasgow is building chemical cells and chemputers, whilst Martin Hanzek at the University of Southern Denmark is investigating the computational potential of smart oil droplets. The philosophical implications of programmable materials are both engaging and profound. By attributing agency to the material world, we are decentering humans, not by making ourselves less important, but by elevating the status of the non-human things around us so that we can extend our conceptual and physical realm of influence. Indeed, programmable matter expands the realm of humanity, not diminishes it. And if the ability of non-living things to influence human behavior sounds somewhat implausible, then the field of ecology may serve as an example. In the 1970s, natural scientists such as Howard T. Odum began to describe the non-living world as shaping the evolution of living things. Until that point, the idea of ecology was centered around the actions of animals, not their environment. In other words, advances in our understanding of matter is helping us to think beyond the traditional conventions of Western philosophy, which means that when we innovate, we usually place humans at the center of a challenge and then seek a mechanical solution. If we want to innovate more ecologically, we must start to imagine the world as a sea of entangled networks, both human and non-human, which behave probabilistically, not in a deterministic fashion, and which enable contradictions to coexist. But simply changing our problem-solving frameworks will not result in paradigm shifts immediately in our practice. The challenge for 21st century innovators who want to work ecologically, who want to change the current paradigms of invention and entrepreneurship, have a great task ahead of them. Our current innovators are setting new ways of thinking for the next generation of innovators, who will then take those ideas and create the infrastructures that are necessary for the next generation of technologists to come along and work with those ideas, which then may result in sociological and cultural influences that enable human development to work with the incredible forces of nature rather than against them. So let's return to Venice. What if the fabric around her body was not weighing her down, but could act to stop the ground from sinking underneath her? Perhaps using programmable matter, it might literally be possible to grow an artificial limestone reef underneath her foundations, which rest upon wood piles. I've been working with a smart chemical droplet system that possesses lifelike qualities. It's kind of cool because it can move around its environment, it senses it, it acts in groups, it can make solid materials. In other words, it behaves really like a lifelike thing, but it does not possess DNA, so it is not a living thing. And it uses a much more general programming languages that acts and serves to create droplets that can behave under different conditions in different ways. And if we think of these droplets as being the bodies of carrier systems that we can use to introduce different chemistries into, and they hitch a ride on all these wonderful things that movement and lifelike qualities allow them to possess, then these chemistries can be moved around an environment and deployed when the right environmental conditions are reached. And in the laboratory, we've shown that these droplets can move away from light, and they can also deposit these limestone-like materials. So potentially, if we could combine these two, then we could introduce them into the Venice waterways so that the droplets could move towards the darkened foundations of the city of Venice, where they would effectively form an accretion technology by depositing mineral shells around the wood piles. These deposits would gradually thicken and produce an artificial reef that gradually spreads the point load of the city over a broader base. Well, that's all very cool, right? But what if the situation changes? What if Venice is actually raised through reinflating her aquifers as proposed by Pietro Tietini's research group in 2001? Or if the Moses Gates produce a tipping point in the lagoon so that it starts to dry out when they're raised in 2014? In this way, programmable matter is neat. Unlike machines, it is responsive to its environment, and because of its fundamentally complex nature and parallel processing powers, the smart droplets play a different role under these conditions to the ones that they were initially imagined to perform. Should the lagoon water subside, smart droplets are likely to coat the wood piles with a limestone-like material, which stops the posts from rotting in the air and causes Venice to crumble. This flexibility in the technology is a very attractive one, since it works in a completely different way to machines and does not require an accurate prediction of future events to provide effective solutions. These programmable materials quite literally respond to environmental changes much more in keeping with the way that life does. And just to be clear, the performance of programmable materials that I've described will not embody the ideas of T2 Terminator machines, or even bring about the morphing clouds of pixelated materials that we were promised during the 1990s. But they will be much more like living things, and we might think of them as being kinds of artificial natures. But these are not natures that exist independently of us. They require our full participation for them to survive at all. Developing programmable matter raises profoundly ethical and moral questions as they challenge our assumptions about our role in the natural world. However, before any lifelike technologies may be used effectively in our homes and in our buildings, we need different kinds of infrastructures to those that are currently used to feed our buildings, which cater to the needs of machines through electrical cables, Wi-Fi, and fiber optics. Indeed, programmable matter shares the same kinds of infrastructures that people need and must be in sufficiently abundant supply if they are to thrive. And if we are to apply the principles of programmable materials to address some of our urban spaces and the challenges that they face, they need to exist in landscapes of abundant resources. And in our resource-constrained urban environments, creative thinking is needed to identify and bring into the existence, these resource-rich sites, through strategic design and engineering. For example, algae that harness energy from sunlight and transform carbon dioxide into biomass could be used to be housed in giant aquariums which are flowing through building facades. Programmable materials may respond effectively to these new terrains through decoration. They may form patterns within our window frames that change over the course of the day, or dance to our music. Rather than being icons of austerity, our buildings may celebrate fertility, housing entire ecosystems of overlapping material programs that make renewable energy, recycle water, and turn our waste into fertile soil. And we work with them, not by condemning matter to become our beasts of burden, but invite them to join thriving communities of independent agents. Perhaps bacteria will hum chemical operas whilst they produce their bioluminescent symphonies for us in the darkness. And maybe we'll be able to hear them through phototransducers that sympathetically vibrate our windows like loudspeakers. This field of design and innovation is still in its earliest stages of development. As I noted earlier, there is no great big market opportunity out there through which we are going to receive profits in 3 to 5 year cycles. This is a big challenge in the sense that if we're going to do these kinds of innovations, then they need to be sustained and they need to work creatively across generations. You know, the day of the innovator being a genius isolated in a loft that comes up with the product that saves the world is no longer happening. And I think that this has been absolutely embodied in the whole issue of who exactly gets the Nobel Prize when it comes down to the Higgs boson. So synthetic biology, unconventional computing are already demonstrating ways of solving problems in an ecologically integrated way beyond the capabilities of industrial mechanical practices. Perhaps programmable matter can bestow our damsel Venice with many different new fabrics spun by the technology she loves, and perhaps when she is draped in this material finery, she may even be free to take care of herself. Thank you.
Wow.
This needs to go to somebody.
Put it on the table. Thanks a lot, Rachel. That was fascinating. Where do we begin? Okay, questions. The microphone's available. So if you have any, you've been very shy so far, but if any of you are feeling brave and you'd like to ask a question, the microphone is there. Otherwise, we've got Twitter, of course. Let's start by giving you your gift. Your picture's called Miss Molecule and Paul the waiter. I said the water.
Oh, she's awesome.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that's you. So
I think she's got a few cute protocells there, don't you?
And there's your maker kit. I mean, your work is exposing something that I think intrinsically we've always known, that life is not that special and different from all the other matter in the universe, but you're really laying that bare.
I think that so for me, you know, the virtual world and all this data exchange and all the communicating we're doing, I mean, that's important because I think the biggest thing that virtuality has helped us do is to share ideas, you know, and of course I would say that as a TED Fellow, okay. But I think it's really important because it's become a catalyst for change. But the thing is that change is embodied. You know, change is a fundamentally material thing, and I think that if anything, I would like to lay out the material constraints of, you know, all these flows of things that we're trying to encourage, you know, in innovation in our cities, in our societies, and actually look at the consequences of that.
Yes. I mean, you're talking about matter without DNA sensing its environment. What is the leading hypothesis on how that happens?
Well, essentially, you know, biology is just one version of chemistry.
Right.
Right. And you know, I think we fetishize the biological system as a way of, you know, idealizing solutions. So biomimicry does that beautifully. You know, biomimicry. Oh, look, you know, we've found a caterpillar egg that works in a particularly beautiful way and it glows in the dark and has a funny sheen. You know, let's make one of those. So you use industrial methods to go and do that. And I guess what I'm trying to do is to repolarize the ideas in the sense that, yes, biology does show us through process, which I think is the most important thing about biomimicry. It's the process, not the product that actually helps us explore. And at the bottom of those processes are these chemical systems, and I think we can actually really engage, with the parallel processing power of matter and actually let the materials do some of the work themselves. But it's not just a free-for-all. There are constraints. There are conditions in which this works well and which it doesn't work well. And I think, perhaps, my favorite invention on the Time 100 list was the artist who set up a room in which a beautiful white fluffy cloud appears right in the center of this room. That, for me, that's innovation. Gee, they didn't kind of squirt stuff into the air to make it happen. He just understood the conditions of the site so well that the probability that the cloud would happen actually occurred.
Well, it becomes inevitable, right? I mean, we already, science over the last couple of centuries has made us feel pretty inadequate and small and insignificant in the universe. And really, when you talk about the inevitability of things, when there's no other way that they could be, you feel even less special, which is part of it.
I think what science has done is it's given us a almost unshakably deterministic view of the world. So in other words, when we think about futures, we think of a present, and then we take a few variables, we cast them, along some kind of projection, whether that's, logarithmic or whether it's linear. And then we say, this is the future point that we're working towards. It's going to happen by 2050. This is what we need. And we solve a future that doesn't actually exist. And so I prefer to think of, what we're currently describing as a future as being, a set of unevenly distributed presents, and through which we actually do have co-authorship with. So it's not that we can't do anything about the future, but we can actually bring things together to increase the probability that something that we want to happen is actually going to emerge. I think this is why, this kind of conversation, this kind of platform, is I think part of that process.
Right, and I wish we could continue this discussion all day. In fact, I might get you in a corner later and continue it anyway, but we need to move on because we have a panel discussion coming soon. I just want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, so if we have anything from Twitter, could we perhaps go to that?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions actually about the risks of these nature programming. Do you see risks in that?
There is risk with being alive. I think the idea of a risk-free anything, I think, is a fiction. I think, and this is what science and technology does do. Things exist within realms of probability. So when I bake a cake, I know if I put eggs and sugar and flour and whatever else I need in there. See, I don't bake a lot fat. And I stick it in the oven and I change the environmental conditions. I know relatively, I'm either going to end up with a biscuit, which is most usual, or like my grandmother, I get a fluffy, great, big, delicious, gorgeous thing that I would consume immediately. And there's actually a spectrum of possibility within that. When I open the oven, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get a sausage roll. I didn't put any sausages in there. So, I mean, essentially, when we're designing with programmable matter, we know that we're working with calcium ions and, fatty molecules. And there's a set of probabilities that those kinds of combinations, can produce. And yes, sometimes they, surprise us. But the basic practices are kind of agricultural, cooking, gardening, working with small children. I mean, all of those kinds of principles as to how you manage that kind of unpredictable complexity, all apply to the materials.
Okay. Perhaps one more question from Twitter? No? What was it about Venice, as a bit of an aside? We saw these images last week of this couple swimming in a piazza in Venice with the water rising, and we kind of look at it and have a giggle, but there's a very serious issue facing Venice, as you've highlighted. How urgent is the situation, and what originally attracted you to Venice?
The situation with Venice is getting more urgent. I mean, the deterioration of the buildings is proceeding at a shocking rate. And I guess it's like, I'm alive whilst this is happening, and I guess it's the human thing to not want to lose this, icon of human history, this, symbol of, the best in all of us, really.
Right.
And what can we actually do to to enable this experience to still be shared by generations beyond us, even if we have to transform it in some way. You know, I think it's a human symbol of the best that we could possibly be, and that's worth saving.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't have built it on matchsticks, right?
But that's
Anyway.
all we had, you know.
Right, right. Okay.